I am just really thrilled that you get a chance tonight to hear who I believe to be one of the most important voices for the defense of the faith and the defense of Scripture. And one of my very good friends is with great honor for me to introduce to you, Dr. Peter J. Williams.
Well, it's just so good to be here. And we've just had since Saturday, my family and I, unfortunately my wife couldn't make it this time, but it's been so nice for my children and myself to be here and to be so well hosted. And I reflect on how I came here 2 times ago, lecturing some years ago, and I looked out and it was a sea of unknown faces. And as I look out tonight, I actually recognize quite a number of you. So that's really nice as I've been getting to know more Houston friends. Well, let's think of the subject, does the Bible support slavery? And I want to begin with a bit of a survey amongst those who are here in the chapel. How many of you think that slavery is morally all right? I just need to get this on record in order to see. Is there anyone out there who thinks that slavery is all right? I'm looking for a hand. I see none. Okay. Let's look at another question. How many of you think that military draft can be morally all right? That is, conscripting people into the army. Yes, we got some people up there. Some more, yes, Mark included. That's good. Not sure about Becky's not so sure. Okay, anyone over here? Military draft, all right? Yeah, good. Now, it's interesting because what's the difference between a slave and military draft? Well, I think there is quite a difference. But in terms of actual not being free when you're drafted in the military for a cause, hopefully it's a good cause, then actually you're not at all free. Let's ask another question. How many of you think it could be morally all right for people serving life imprisonment for, say, murder, rape, something like that, to be made to work? Okay, yeah, we got a lot of you there. So in that sense, we're just establishing parameters. We believe that slavery is wrong, but actually, we don't believe that always forced labor is necessarily wrong. And that's an interesting thing because it means we're going to have to start distinguishing in our minds between slavery and forced labor. Because I guess if I'd asked some of you what is slavery, you might well have said to me, forced labor. And so clearly, there's something about what you feel that actually the situation of military draft and also the situation of life, people doing life imprisonment for really serious crimes, that's actually very different from what we're talking about when we're talking about slavery. Because when we're talking about slavery, automatically we're thinking about real situations. We're thinking about things like people trafficking that goes on today. Or we're thinking about what was going on before the abolition of slavery in the US. Those are the sorts of real situations we're thinking about. And when I talk tonight about slavery, I don't want to talk about theoretical things that might come under the category of slavery. I'm not thinking of an abstracted definition of people being forced to work. I'm thinking about real historical situations. Because when we talk about slavery, we tend to be talking about historical particularities, particular situations. Now, my thesis is that when we consider historical definitions of slavery, it's clear that the Bible does not support that kind of slavery. But I want to begin with a quotation from an atheist. Here is atheist Sam Harris in his letter to a Christian nation. In assessing the moral wisdom of the Bible, it's useful to consider moral questions that have been solved to everyone's satisfaction. Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. That's a word he got from the Bible. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible, and you will discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. Now, some of you might think, he's weaseling towards the end of that quotation when he says, expects us. He doesn't command us. What do you mean, expects us? But Sam Harris can't be tripped up that easily, because the next thing he does is he quotes the Bible. From Leviticus chapter 25 in the Revised Standard Version, this is what it says. And this is the Bible, my friends. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. And as we, most of us, I presume, Christians, read a passage like that, we're made uncomfortable by a number of words. There's the word slave, talking about buying people. I hope you're uncomfortable with that. Talking about them being property, talking about them being a possession forever. We sort of feel, oh, what on earth is that doing in the Bible? So we have a problem. Firstly, Bible translations talk of slaves. Secondly, that in the Old Testament no objection is made to having slaves. Thirdly, in the New Testament, Christians who have slaves aren't told to free them. In fact, slaves are told to submit. Therefore, biblical texts approve of slavery. Fourthly, we know that slavery is wrong. Therefore, biblical texts approve of something that is wrong. How many of you are made uncomfortable by that set of syllogisms? Anyone prepared to raise their hand? That's what we're going to try and wrestle with tonight. So our outline is firstly to look at the translation of the term slave. Secondly, to look at the essence of what's going on in the Old Testament. Thirdly, to hear the story of Exodus, probably like you've never heard it before. And fourthly, to look at what the New Testament does with this. So, first, before we go into any of this, we just need to learn one Hebrew word, and that is that big word in the middle, and it's pronounced eved, and it can be written now either as ebed or eved, with a little apostrophe. Really, it's called a rough breathing, or an ayin before that, and its plural is avadim. Okay, so that's eved, avadim. This is a word we're going to be talking about because it's a word that is commonly translated slave. But just how commonly is it translated slave? Point number one, translation. Back in the days of the King James Version, 1611, you know, King James commissioned a new Bible. And there were only two occurrences of the word slave in his version. Once in the Old Testament, once in the New Testament. By the time the New King James Version came along, which is a 20th century translation, there were 46 occurrences of this term. The NIV, the New Revised Standard Version, even more. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, the Jewish Publication Society, by the way, that's just got the Old Testament in, the Jewish Publication Society, when it translated this particular term, or in terms of its the number of occurrences in the entire Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, how many times did they use the word slave? Thrice, that's all. But when it was revised in 1985, 135 occurrences. Nor is this only what's going on in English translations. Let's think about German translations for a moment. And you find that in the old Luther Bible and the less old Luther Bible, all the way through to 1912, how many occurrences do they have of the German word Sklave and its feminine Sklavin? How many occurrences? Zilch, zero. But when you have the revised Luther version in 1984, you have a whole 70. Or you go to your Spanish translations. Think of the old Reina Valera translation from 1909. Just 4 occurrences of this word esclavo, feminine esclava. But when it's revised in 1960, of course, they throw a few more in. And in 1995, even more. We get up to 65. Do you notice a tendency? This is something that's not just going on in English, it's going on in French, it's going on in German, Dutch, it's going on in Spanish, it's going on in Afrikaans, it's going on in Italian. In these Western European languages, or languages with Western European origins, there's a whole growth in the use of the word slave, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. So when we look at our earlier translations in the 4 left-hand columns, English, King James, Revised Version, American Standard Version, Jewish Publication Society, we have very few occurrences. When we look at more recent translations, the right-hand 4 columns, Revised Standard Version, New International Version, Jewish Publication Society Revised, New Revised Standard Version, we see an awful lot. And this results in some interesting changes. The only occurrence in the King James Version of the word slave in the Old Testament was in Jeremiah 2 verse 14, where it says, "Is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave?" And we notice it's got poetic parallelism. So in other words, the word it uses in the line 1 is servant. The word it uses in line 2 for something equivalent is slave. We notice, moreover, that this is in italics, or in the original King James Version printing, in small print. And you use that in order to represent a word which is not in the original. In other words, the only occurrence in the entire Old Testament was a non-occurrence, where there wasn't actually a Hebrew word standing behind it, but they'd run out of words in a translating poetic parallelism. They really needed a word, and so they came up with the word slave. Contrast that with the New Revised Standard Version of 1989, which has exactly the same words as the King James Version, but simply reversed. Slave and servant the other way round. By the time you get to 1989, people say, aha, this word means slave. And so they render it thus, and when they need another term, they think, we'll use servant. Interesting. I think it's interesting. You may not. And this sort of thing also means that there are some interesting inconsistencies. Now, I don't speak Finnish. Maybe some of you do. But I've spoken to people who do. Real Finns. There are some. And what happens is I ask them about their words to render slave language and servant language in the Old Testament. And they say there's the O word, which you see on the page, which is a baddie word, and there's the P word, which is a nice word. We might think of them as equivalent to our words slave and servant. And what we find is that the same Hebrew word is getting rendered with the bad word at certain times, and then with the good word at other times. And so when it's talking about slave laws in Exodus chapter 21, if that's what it's talking about, then it's using the O word, the bad word. But when it's talking about Joshua or Moses being the servant of the Lord, it will be using the good word. When it's talking about the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 52, going through to 53, it uses the good word. We look at Swedish, and we see that Swedish is doing something very similar. It uses the equivalent of the word thrall, as in to be enthralled, to be enslaved, for two of the same occurrences, but it uses its more positive T word in the other occurrences. But then we find other languages not doing that at all. We find Russian just uses the word R-A-B, rab, right the way through. Of course, rab is related to our word robot, which is just a worker, does things for you. The idea was they're going to make our lives easier, but I haven't really seen that many robots making our life easier more recently. Then, what happens in Hungarian? Well, they just go with their word solga right the way through. So you find some languages are differentiating. They've got nice occurrences and nasty occurrences. Other languages are just saying we're going to do this whole thing the same way. And this can result in some rather strange things. Take, for instance, Leviticus 25, verse 42. Here we have the RSV, and the ESV, I'm on the committee of that, does exactly the same. For they are my servants, uses that word eved, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves, uses the word eved. Now, I would have thought that the logic of this passage requires, and this is the sort of thing I would vote for if it came onto a committee, and I might have voted for, but it would be confidential, so I couldn't declare that to you. And I would think logic demands it be translated the same way both times. But actually, well, that might make God into a slave owner, and we wouldn't like that. And be sold as servants. Aha, our word servant has changed. I think what used to be the case is that if you think of Venn diagrams where you've got two circles that overlap, that the word servant and the word slave would overlap more. But now the word servant means non-slave. So in other words, what's happened is we feel we can't render it without differentiating these two, when actually it's the same Hebrew word. Consider a Hebrew dictionary. Here we have the Sheffield Hebrew Dictionary, 8 volumes, and how does it render this word eved? Well, it gives meaning number 1, slave, meaning number 2, servant. And that's its head definition, that's line 1. Go down to line 5, and it gives you the first explication of that where it says again, slave first, servant next. But then when you look at the article as a whole, and actually it goes over a double-page spread, you find that the number of lines taken up with the meaning slave first, servant next is far fewer than the whole of the rest of the article, which is taken up with this definition servant first and then slave next. So if this article itself admits that most of the time it's going to render the term servant, why does it insist that the word slave is the primary meaning? There's been, in fact, a reversal going on since the 19th century. Look in a 19th century Hebrew dictionary, first meaning is servant. Look in a late 20th century Hebrew dictionary, and the first meaning will generally be slave. What's been going on there? Well, one of the things about the rise in use of the translation slave is actually it means there's a mismatch between the meaning of this word in Hebrew and what's actually going on in the dictionaries. This is how one of the most detailed studies of the term and the Hebrew root concluded. It says that this term is essentially a dynamic relational term. The person marked with this root is characterized as dependent on their relational partner. In other words, it's not generally a term where you use for a slave on their own, a definition of a class. It's actually a definition of someone in relation with someone else. In other words, you have like a servant and a master. That's the sort of term that it is. We also know that this could be quite a high honor. Here we have an ancient Hebrew seal impression, and on it says, belonging to Shema, the Eved of Jeroboam. Now clearly this is a high-up person. He's got his own seal. It's a very nice seal. And he's very proud of being the servant of Jeroboam. Rendering it as slave of Jeroboam is going to give us the wrong sense. So this Hebrew word gets translated nowadays both servant and slave. Majority of the time it is translated servant, because there are 800 occurrences or so in the Old Testament, and few translations render more than about 135 of those as slave. So the majority meaning is the word servant. But it's a word that is not inherently negative. It really relates to work. The person is subservient. Some people say a lot of the occurrences in the Old Testament are just being polite when they go along and they say, what does my Lord say to his servant? Which is a bit like saying, what do you say to me? But in fact, it doesn't just mean that. Because when you address someone as Lord and you say that you're their servant, you are always socially obliged to do what they say. So in other words, it is not mere politeness. And in fact, in this context, everyone is the servant of someone. Even the king is the servant of God. And everyone else is a servant of the king. Now I know you are not, on the whole, subjects of the Queen, my two children apart, but I am a subject of Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, and long may she reign. One of the great things about not living in democracy, I mean, democracies, I'm afraid, get the governments they deserve. And in a monarchy, you can sometimes do better than you deserve. You might do worse as well. But there we are. Let's not go into that. That was a distraction, sorry. That was off script. It wasn't actually planned. What we can say is that everyone in the Old Testament is the servant of someone else, including the king, who is a servant of the God in the ancient Near East. The king is a servant of the God, which means that they don't have the category that we now have of the free. Ever heard of the land of the free? Well, they don't have that category of thinking of a large group of people as essentially free, able to do whatever they like, because socially and economically, people simply weren't. That has to be factored in. So when we use the modern word slave, we remember it is in opposition to free, and it's somewhat problematic as we use it, because it uses an irredeemably negative term, but it's actually rendering a term which doesn't necessarily have negative connotation. It leads us to some inconsistency in translation, and what it means is it's very hard for readers to read the Old Testament and not think about later history. So when we read the word slave in the Old Testament, we tend to impose on it some of the things that have happened since the time of the Old Testament, whether it's Roman slavery, Brazilian slavery, Caribbean slavery, North American slavery, the sorts of slavery that the British and American fleets, the British and French fleets supported. That's what we think about. But if we're reading the Old Testament, we have to remember none of that had happened. None of it. So as we read back into the Old Testament, we've got to strip out all of our knowledge of subsequent history in order to make sure we're reading the texts fairly. So let's think about what's actually going on in the Old Testament. Firstly, the essence of the Old Testament institution. In the time of the patriarchs, the sort of work that the people were doing who were in his household, they were herdsmen, they were domestic servants. And it's not that they were slaves, all of them, in the sense that we find later. For instance, one of Abraham's servants, Eliezer of Damascus, is going to inherit everything that he has if he doesn't produce any offspring. We find that the children of Jacob's second-tier wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, are going to inherit. And by the way, the narrative is very clear that having second-tier wives is a bad idea, because every time we have polygamy in the Old Testament, we see huge social conflict. We see children trying to kill each other, sell Joseph as a slave. Look at the problems in David's own household. The narrative is telling you this is a bad idea. But the children of Hagar, Bilhah, and Zilpah are free. And the servants of Abraham could be trusted with valuables. Abraham would send off one of his servants, okay, it's his most trusted servant, with a whole load of camels and a whole load of wealth, hundreds of miles away to find a wife for Isaac. He didn't do a runner. In fact, when Abraham's nephew Lot was taken captive, Abraham armed all of his servants, every man in his house, he armed them. One of the things that does not happen in slave society is that people hand out weapons. And in this context, I don't see any approved selling of people unless it's people selling themselves, and we'll come on to that. But we do nevertheless read that Abraham is to circumcise everyone in his household, including those acquired in exchange for silver, or as many translations would say today, money, although they didn't have coinage back then. And that's something we need to take into account. How exactly did Abraham acquire these people? When we compare what was going on in the Old Testament under the law with what was going on in the Roman world and in North America under slavery, what do we find? Well, in the case of the Old Testament, we find that servants all had access to holiday. That wasn't given in the Roman world. There were Sabbath laws in the North American context. Food enough, yes. There is strong commendation of looking after all of those dependent on you. And legal redress, yes. Everyone, it seems, had equal access to the city gate to mount a legal case. Of course, those who were being shipped off from West Africa on the ships couldn't say, I would like to speak to my attorney. It was not possible. Sexual protection. The Old Testament has very strict laws on sexual protection, and that's something that needs to be borne in mind. As for kidnapping, the Old Testament made that a capital offense. Are these people put in chains as they work? There is no mention of chains, so it's very different from the cotton fields. As for torture or physical abuse, we find it in the Old Testament, if someone so much as knocked out the tooth of one of their servants, they had to let them go free of all future obligation. As for runaways, this is what the Old Testament says. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose, within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. Now just imagine if the Romans had run with a law like that. It would have been rather different. Contrast typical antebellum South rules, where failure to deliver a escaped slave meant you could get 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine, when you think what the dollar was worth back then. Or you think of the law code of Hammurabi, the ancient Babylonian king, who says if anyone find runaway male or female slaves in the open country and bring them to their masters, the master of the slaves shall pay him 2 shekels of silver. There are rewards for finding captured slaves, as there were in North America, as there were in Rome. Look at the law of South Carolina in 1740, and it shall be further enacted by the aforesaid authority aforesaid, that if any slave who shall be out of the house or plantation where such slave shall live, or shall be usually employed, or without some whiter person in company with such slave, shall refuse to submit or undergo the examination of any white person, it shall be lawful for any such white person to pursue, apprehend, and moderately correct such slave. And if any such slave shall assault or strike such white person, such slave may be lawfully killed. So when we look historically, it seems to me that there's no doubt that the greatest historical shame in North American history is slavery. One of the greatest shames in British history was our support of that, our fleets. And let's remember that, of course, until the Revolutionary War, much of the slavery that went on in North America went on under British hegemony. In other words, it's something that we share a sense of shame about. Now, some people, as they read the Old Testament, say, but doesn't the Old Testament do exactly the same, treating slaves simply as chattel? And I want to look at the underlined verses here in this passage, where we find in Exodus chapter 21, it says this, verse 20, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Now, I want to just comment on the translation here, that when it says the slave is his money, remember there is no such word as money in the Old Testament times, and literally this is silver. And people read this and they say, well, look, what it's saying is he can beat them, and if they die, there is no revenge. Although, of course, verse 20 does say if they do die, he is to be avenged, although it doesn't say how. But we need to look at the context of this before we come to any premature judgments. So let's look at the verses immediately preceding. Exodus 21, verse 18. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear, only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Now this law is dealing with a circumstance where there is not there is immediate damage, but there is some recovery after a time. So it's grouped together, as laws are often grouped together, because they share common elements. Both of them share a time delay. We also look 4 verses later, and this is what it says. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. Now, when we bear in mind that knocking out the tooth of a slave meant that you had to let them go free, we have to read that as one of the parameters for this law underlined in the middle. It is not giving you license to physically abuse a servant or slave in any way you possibly choose. Rather, what it's doing is it is giving guidance to the judges. And the judges are looking particularly at the question of intention. Intention to kill someone is a terrible thing, and yet there is the possibility that there was a beating and several days later someone died coincidentally. And the judges are to take this as a serious consideration. And this we think about when we consider that word for. For the slave is his money. Some people would read that phrase and think like this. The slave belongs to him, so he can do what he likes with them. But that won't actually fit with the rest of the Old Testament, where very clearly the logic, if the slave was his money, well, he could knock out their tooth too, couldn't he? That actually undermines that reading of the text. I want us to think a little bit more about the word for, or because. And the way we're going to do this is by looking at another law. Here we find an Old Testament law where it says this. If in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor. Because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. Now, what this law is saying is that out in the open country, a man's testimony and a woman's testimony are not equal. The woman's testimony trumps the man's testimony because, and you notice the because clause is a because telling the judges, those judging the case, what they are to assume has happened. And in this case, they are to assume her innocence, that she could do nothing about this. Now, if we consider that the same in the case of Exodus 21, because the for clause, because this man had an investment in this worker, we are to presume the person's innocence of intention to actually damage his own investment. That's what it's saying. It's not saying because he owned them, he could do what he liked. That's not what the rest of the Old Testament says. But all of this language of property, ownership, and sale may well make us uncomfortable. So we need to think further about that. Firstly, of course, that selling and buying in Hebrew don't have separate terms from acquiring without money and so on. We actually find that there's some merging of vocabulary between acquiring and buying. And that what we're dealing with in many situations is debt, slavery, or servitude. You're in a subsistence economy. There's no economic surplus, and you run out of everything. How are you going to persuade your neighbor to give you something to eat? Well, of course, they might do based on their own mercy, because the law has commanded them to be merciful. But if they don't, the only thing you can do is pledge your future work in exchange for a meal today. And of course, many of us would do that in that situation. So rather than people going on the market, we see actually what's happening in the Old Testament is people are either selling themselves or they're selling their daughters. Now, when they're selling their daughters, are they trying to cash in on their daughters? How many camels can I get for my daughter today? I once knew a girl who was offered 4.5 camels for her hand in marriage. I don't know how that worked. But anyway, my daughter would go for much more. But are people trying to cash in on their daughters? No, rather what's happening is every marriage involves financial exchange, because people give money to the bride's father, but also the bride's father at the same time gives dowry to the bride, giving her financial security so that if he cheats on her, she's actually got a base of money. There's some money which is actually, or it's not money, it's silver and wealth and so on, which actually is keeping that family unit together. So what people are ultimately doing is temporary leasing of their own work, and we find that there is no explicit evidence of salesmen within the law. Of course, we find that going on in the Joseph story, but that's very disapproved of. And bodies retain rights, and of course, in the whole context, God ultimately owns everything. So when we find the Old Testament speaking about this, we find these wonderful words in the book of Job, where Job says, if I've rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant, when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? Now, you might still be troubled by what's going on in the Old Testament, and justifiably so. But in order to read the Old Testament, we've got to understand what the Old Testament is. When Jesus Christ was asked about the subject of divorce, he said to the Pharisees, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And in doing so, he gave a wonderful window into how we should read the Old Testament. We need to begin with creation and then go on to the law, realizing that the law came afterwards. And this same principle that Jesus used in looking at divorce, but then going back to the beginning and saying, what's God's original intention and pattern, we can apply to all sorts of other things, including the subject of polygamy, where we can see clearly back in the beginning, there was no such thing, but actually it is regulated in the law. There was no such thing as servitude, and yet in the law we see it regulated. So it's a bit like this. You might have some laws in your state which regulate gambling. The fact that you have laws regulating gambling doesn't mean the people who wrote those laws think that gambling's a good thing at all. They're actually putting some limits on it. So what I'd want to do is understand the Old Testament as permitting something, regulating something, rather than saying, this is good. So when you're not happy with something in the Old Testament, don't think God was necessarily happy either. Now let's go on to a further point. It's story time, isn't it, really? Let's think about a story. So let's go to the book of Exodus and think of the story of the book of Exodus. Now the story as we usually hear it goes something like this. the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians. So far, so good? Yeah? And then God brought them out of Egypt. Happy with that? And in doing so, he made them free, so they were no longer slaves. Now, I've already given a little bit of a hint about the way the word free is not so common in the Old Testament. But this seems to me a very justifiable story, because after all, isn't this what we find in something where, like Deuteronomy 6, verse 21, where actually the young man the parents are told to tell their children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with all these great wonders. So, you can see it really seems very justifiable. They were slaves to the Egyptians. But I want to complicate things. There are some problems with that story in making it quite so simple. And that is that the text of the book of Exodus, although it does say that the Israelites worked in a way that we would see as slavery, it does not explicitly use the word eved of the Israelites in the land of Egypt. It does not say that they were servants or slaves of the Egyptians. Back then, of course, there wasn't a strong slave-free contrast, since everyone was a servant of someone else. But nevertheless, as the story goes, the Israelites are to come out of Egypt in order to serve God. Some modern translations will say worship, but the key thing is that the word is the same as the word serve. It is the word from the same root as the word eved. Now, when we look at the way it is described, this is how it's put at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Pharaoh says to his henchmen, come, let's deal shrewdly with them, that's the Israelites, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick. And in all kinds of work in the field, in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Now, in those 5 verses, you can see that there are various words explaining that it was hard for the Israelites. Various words, various expressions. And twice we get, in our translation, the word slaves. But that is not giving us the noun, eved. It's in fact giving us a verb, and the translation here has chosen to use the word slave. In other words, we don't find that this word slave comes up in the narrative of Exodus. In fact, what we find is the word servant, the word eved, is used rather for the Egyptians. You see, the Israelite foremen say to Moses and to Aaron, the Lord look on you and judge, because you've made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants of Vadim, and have put a sword in their hands to kill us. Or again, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his servant before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water of the Nile turned into blood. And I'm going to give you 18 more references that you could have. In other words, as you're reading through this text, again and again, you're hit with the term Pharaoh and his servants, Pharaoh's servants, the Egyptian servants. Now, we don't often see that because we think, oh, the Israelites are the servants, not the Egyptians. The Egyptians are the free people who are making the servants work, right? But that's not what the text is saying. The text is using the word servant, servant, servant all the time of the Egyptians. 21 occurrences. And only one with the Israelites. And this is where it is. The foremen complain about being made to work hard. The foreman of the people of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants. Yet they say to us, make bricks, and behold, your servants are beaten, for the fault is your own people. Well, actually, 3 occurrences there, but it's all in one text. Where they're saying, we are your servants, so treat us nicely. In other words, the logic is, we are close to you. Now, these are the collaborating Israelites, right? And they are trying to establish their close relationship with Pharaoh by using this word servant. So that's what they're doing. In other words, they're really ramping up their own position by using the word servant. So it's not that servant is a complete underling, someone oppressed. Rather, Pharaoh needs to treat them nicely. So when you actually look at the ratio, it's pretty remarkable that there are so many more occurrences of the word servant referring to the Egyptians than to the Israelites. But what we find is there are some occurrences where we have that God brought the Israelites out of the house of Avadim, the plural of Eved. Many different occurrences of this, particularly in Deuteronomy, it has to be said, not in the book of Exodus. But this is where one of the occurrences in the book of Exodus. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery." That's how it's translated, but actually it's the plural of the word Eved. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out of this place. And when we read the house of slavery, we think of it quite easily. We think of it, well, the Israelites are slaves in the land of Egypt. There might have been other people slaves in the land of Egypt, and they've been brought out of that slavery. But I think there's a question in the text. Who are the real slaves in the land of Egypt? Are in fact some of the Egyptians part of that house of slavery? That is, when the Israelites are out, there is still this serving of Pharaoh going on. It's also translated sometimes house of bondage. Literally, it's the house of Ardim. Well, who were they? The obvious answer is Israel were the people, the Avadim in this particular case. And one justification would be the text I've already mentioned from Deuteronomy, not from Exodus. From Deuteronomy, we find that it is said, "We were Pharaoh's slaves, Avadim, in Egypt." There are other references to that. The Passover festival in the liturgy there, it says, "We were brought out from slavery to freedom." But there's a more complicated answer. And this is what we get, I think, from reading Genesis and Exodus. This is what God says to Pharaoh through Moses. "Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son." Pharaoh's great error was making someone else's son work for him. And in fact, what we see is another theme going on in the book of Genesis, and this is in chapter 47. I'm going to read an extended passage. This is what happens when Joseph is in charge of the land of Egypt. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herd of our livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made them servants of them, from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you. You shall sow the land, and at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh. And 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the fields, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, sorry, got a footnote in there, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Who are the freeholders in the land of Egypt? It's the Israelites. So what we see is a rather remarkable thing. Now this also fits with another set of themes in the book of Genesis. And that is the whole idea of a consequence chain. That one thing happens and then something else happens as a result. So for instance, we find that the patriarch Jacob tricks his father Isaac with a goat skin that he is his older brother. Is that the end of the story? No, because what's going to happen is then his father-in-law is going to trick him that the older sister is the younger sister. Jacob's father, Isaac, was blind. So Jacob's father-in-law tricks Jacob in the dead of night, because everyone's blind then. Then we find that Laban can't get away with his trickery because he has to be tricked by the daughter he tricked against. And so Rachel refuses to get up when she has stolen the household gods. But that's not the end of the story, because then we find that the sons of Leah particularly trick Jacob with goat's blood of all things to sell, and they end up selling their brother Joseph to the Egyptians. Then we find one of the chief sons of Leah, the daughter that was tricked with by Laban, is tricked by his daughter-in-law, and the whole thing involves a goat, because Tamar dresses up as a prostitute, and you know the rest of the story. Genesis 38, good read. Then we find that, of course, Joseph ends up tricking his brothers about his identity, and in the end of it all, Joseph buys the Egyptians. Why does Joseph buy the Egyptians? Because they had the nerve to buy him in the first place. So in other words, we find a whole chain of things. And that's part of the background to how we got to read Exodus. And the book of Exodus is telling us more than one thing. The Israelites, yes, they are serving the Egyptians with really hard service. They're having to work very hard. They're not free. I would agree in that way, and we can read it legitimately as saying the Israelites are slaves in the land of Egypt. That's what Deuteronomy 6 verse 21 says. But that's not the whole story. There's another side of the story. And in that we realize that also the Egyptians themselves are not free. Pharaoh and his henchmen, don't you think that's the life of free people? And in fact, what are the Israelites to do? They are to come out of Egypt and serve God. And you know the root serve, ayin beit dalet in Hebrew, is used more for what the Israelites go to outside the land of Egypt than what they were doing inside the land of Egypt. They are to serve God. They are to worship God. Him only shall you serve. Even the Passover is called their avodah, the same Hebrew roots coming up. As it says right at the beginning, Exodus chapter 3, that when they come out, they shall serve God on the mountain. Again and again and again and again, we see this word serve. And that's the way we need to realize that when we read back through Leviticus 25 again, we read that they are servants belonging to God. So then we get to John chapter 8. And there we have a lot of irony in John's gospel, but this is what we have in an exchange between Jesus and the Jews. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered, "We're offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it you say you'll become free?" Well, that's an interesting reading of the Old Testament, never been enslaved to anyone. Of course, you think, well, haven't you read Exodus either? But maybe they're reading Exodus in this way. And what we realize is that actually, have they been slaves? Well, it all depends. If they have been children of God, if they have been serving him throughout this, well, arguably, they've never actually been truly anyone as slaves. It's just perhaps that Pharaoh thought they were his slaves, but not really. And the truth will set you free. Well, let's come on now to the New Testament. You see, if the Old Testament talks about people being slaves and it doesn't seem to set them all free, what about the New Testament? Well, I've already argued that the Old Testament can be properly understood as permissive law. That what we have in the Old Testament is sometimes regulating something rather than saying this is ideal. But what about the New Testament? Well, firstly, the idea that the Christians in the New Testament could all change slavery is rather naive, because let's remember that back then they had no votes. So they couldn't just change the legal system. So for Paul to write to them in letters about what the ideal legal system would have been, writing something a bit like Plato's Republic, would have been no help whatsoever to people leading their lives. Moreover, telling slaves to rebel would simply end up with them being executed, probably by crucifixion. That would help nothing. The Romans would certainly win against the slave rebellion. That had been tried in the days of Spartacus. But in fact, there are legal limits to how many slaves anyone could free. Paul could say, masters, free your slaves, but if they'd tried to free their slaves, they would not have been free, because of the lex fufia caninia, for instance, which said if you have 3 slaves, you can only free 2 of them. If you have 10 slaves, you can only free 5 of them. If you have 30 slaves, you can only free 10 of them. Moreover, because of another law, the lex aelia sentia, it could be the case that actually by being freed too early, you would suffer some disadvantage. Because if you got freed before 30, it would be very, very hard to become a citizen and so on. So what we find is, we might sit in our armchairs and think, oh, Paul should have written and said, masters, free your servants, free your slaves. But they would not have been free. If they'd tried to do it, they would not all have been legally free. Those people would actually have been quite vulnerable. What's more, what does the New Testament teach? Well, it can't change the political system, but what it can do is it can say this: we should love others as Christ loved us. Now, enacting that one command on its own abolishes the whole thing, because if you start treating others as Christ loved you, and you think about how much Christ loved you, and how he actually gave himself as the servant for us, as in Philippians 2, then actually that we could only do that by becoming other people's servants. You see? So in other words, that on its own, if people just took that to heart, it would abolish the idea of compelling someone else to be your servant. But further than that, it also teaches the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the siblinghood of those who are following Christ. They're to treat each other as brother and sister. They start using the word bro and sister in a context where those terms are not being used regularly. They're asserting familyness. They're asserting kinship in this grouping of the church. And they do more than that. They also have a kissing campaign. Now, what goes on in the kissing campaign? It's mentioned in the holy kiss in Paul's letters, but also in 1 Peter. So it's not just one particular group. And people say, yes, wasn't it part of the ancient culture to greet each other with a kiss? No. It was not part of the ancient culture that a slave would kiss a master, or that a Jew would kiss a Gentile. It was totally scandalous. Isn't it obvious that it's scandalous? The idea that you would kiss across those ethnic groups, across those social boundaries, scandalous. Whom do you kiss? You kiss your family, you kiss your siblings. In other words, it's not just that they use this brotherhood language, just the words, mere words. It's actually something active. It's something where they, as they meet together, you see all these different social classes, and they have to undertake this kissing campaign. I mean, it's compulsory kissing. If we have compulsory kissing today, or you want to have the holy kiss, maybe your pastor sort of think about reintroducing it in a family, in your church, do start with kissing the people you least want to kiss. That's part of the point of the holy kiss, that you actually make sure that people realize that across those boundaries, we're saying we are one in Christ. And how would Romans have looked at that? People in the Roman Empire, they would have been scandalized by the immorality that all of those boundaries that they had been so careful in putting into place are being broken down. It's like fraternizing across the ranks in the army or something like that. It's just something terrible. You know, that you would try and break down those things. We put all of this effort into maintaining this hierarchy in society, and what are you doing with it? Just breaking it down. And then we see the language of Paul's letters, where he says to masters in Ephesians 6 that they are to give the same to their servants. Well, is that the same as they give to themselves? Or is it in fact the same amongst their servants, or in fact not the same as they give to themselves? And they're told not to threaten. Well, if they're not to threaten, they're certainly not hitting them hard either. You see? They're not to threaten. And they're told God doesn't prefer masters. Or as it says in Colossians, they are to give what's right and equal. We find equality language here. In other words, not just equal amongst themselves, but also equal to what you're giving yourself. Or as Philemon is told, he is to receive Onesimus, probably a runaway slave, back no longer as a slave, but above a slave, a beloved brother. And then through all of this, what's their favorite song? What's the thing they're calling out in their services all the time? Well, it's Jesus is Lord, Kurios. And that word Lord doesn't just mean Lord, it's also the word for master. So who's the name of the person they're worshipping? He's called Master Jesus Christ. You get the idea. They're not just saying, that he's Lord in some sort of worship sense. They're actually saying he is the boss. And that relativizes anyone else's claim to be boss. It makes you look out as you look out at a church where there are some who in Roman terms are masters, others who in Roman terms are slaves. Well, they're kissing each other, they're sitting next to each other, they're embracing each other as brothers and sisters, and they're saying, we follow the Master Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is my master. And when you realize, of course they can't abolish Roman slavery. They're not in a political situation to do that. But what they can do is they can start a new society. In fact, a new ethnic group. Arguably, when you're asked your citizenship, if you're American or even Texan, you should not say American, Texan. You should put Christian. That's actually your citizenship. Now, I'm not saying you should actually fill that in a form. There is a particular thing they intend you to fill in. You should probably put that in. But what I mean is, in reality, our most fundamental identity, our ethnicity, is that we are in Christ. And what these people did is they started a new society, a new race. They're sometimes described as a new race that's come abroad in the Roman Empire, the Christians. And that's what they do. Of course, they can't change the Roman law. They can start a new society within the Roman Empire, which has its own rules, and which there is no slavery. And everyone who's in that society is free from sin and a slave and a servant of the best master there could possibly be. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, occurrences, in reference to the occurrences of slave, the word. Who's doing these translations and revisions?
Well, I mean, there are various people on committees that produce these, but I don't think there's anything malign in what's going on. As I said, one of the changes, I think, is the two world wars, which actually had a big change, certainly in Britain, where you go from a much more hierarchical society to a less hierarchical society, which means that terms like manservant, maidservant, bondservant, these all sound very archaic. And actually people try and simplify that. Nowadays, you don't even have servants. I mean, you may have people who work in your house like servants, but you call them your cook, your au pair. You use any term other than the word servant. If you use the word servant to them, they will feel pretty insulted. And so that's where we've got to realize there have been some changes going on, and I think the translators are trying to respond to that. They're looking at making translations less archaic. They find these old words like manservant, and they think, what does that mean? It means the word slave, and so that's what they do. There's nothing sinister about it, but there is a consequence to that. So, if we think about the King James Version, the interesting thing is that was made in 1611. Arguably, slavery began in North America in 1619, so it's just 8 years later, and so it's worth thinking about how there is that time gap. They are writing at a time when none of that's happened. They're translating at a time when none of that's happened. But it's just interesting to think about. For us, the word slave is a very important word. I find it a very good word to describe political realities, but a very, very poor term when it comes to analyzing substance. Because actually, I do believe that sometimes it can be right for people to be forced to work. I don't think there are many situations in which that's the case. The terrible thing about what went on in New World slavery was the sheer oppression, injustice, and everything about it. The whole thing stinks. But just narrowly isolating the question of can someone in a particular circumstance be morally made to work for someone else, I don't necessarily have a problem in every circumstance. There might be very few circumstances we come across today, but in the cases of crimes and so on, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, so is Jesus Lord or King?
Yes.
Should someone be fixing these translations?
Yes.
Since you're on the English Standard Version Committee, can we expect that to be done soon?
No.
Might you know the percentage of slaves in the ancient societies of Israel, Rome, or the southern U.S.?
Arguably, they're reasonably similar. The way you get the ancient possible slavery numbers in the Old Testament, and this is where we get onto the subject of numbers in the Old Testament, where Mark and I have some different perspectives. But actually, we have a census that goes on in the days of David, and we also know how many people Solomon drafted in order to do his construction. Now, Solomon's actually described as being pretty oppressive to people. It's interesting that as he does the draft, it's I think it's 1 month on and 2 months off, which is quite an interesting thing because it's not actually as oppressive as it could be, but in relative terms, he was oppressive. And you do get to something close to 20% which is not that dissimilar to what you'd find with other settings. But I think actually Solomon is not set up as an ideal in that sense. He is described as walking in all the ways of David his father, which is different from walking in all the ways of the law of Moses, isn't it?
Okay, slave of all, subject to none, dutiful servant of all, and slave to all, Galatians 3. Can you please explain the different uses by Paul?
Well, one of the things Paul's doing is he's writing to people who are in contexts where there are many slaves, many free people in Roman context. And he uses the words free and slave of everyone. So in Romans, we see how he will say you can be slave to sin, free from God, or you can be free from sin and a slave of God. And so these categories apply in every way. He also uses slave language of the way we should submit ourselves to others. So this is clear in Philippians, where we are to have the same mind which is in Christ, who took on the very form of a servant, using the word doulos there in Greek, where that is actually a path to follow, that we are, just as it says in the Gospels, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. So I think there are all sorts of ways that Paul's using this. But you've got to remember that these are not statements of the absolute. They're statements of which are trying to help us grasp some of what's going on. But the underlying direction of things is that those who are in Christ are going to go into this enormous inheritance with Christ. And there is this sense, as we have in the Old Testament, where Joshua brought the children of Israel into their inheritance. We have the same sense in the New Testament that people are going to inherit them. You know, as Christ says, the meek will inherit the earth. So there is that. There's not a sense that you will, as you give yourself up and as you serve others, that will be a situation of everlasting pain. In fact, rather, it's a situation that just as Christ gave up his situation and served and received the name above all names, so we, as we follow in his path, there is a crown and an inheritance for those who do that.
Okay, lightning round.
Okay.
In the Old Testament law, were successive generations of a person who was in servitude automatically placed in servitude themselves?
Probably. So I think with the non-Israelites, it's not clear to me that the Jubilee worked, as in the Jubilee seems to me specifically for Israelites. However, I think we need to understand that there are, I would say that as regulating law, and also that these people have real religious access and privilege, the Nethinim, arguably in the temple, who are in that sort of servitude, need to be understood as people having some privileges.
If buying a slave was actually buying a lease on a person's future work in the Old Testament, was there always the assumption that a time period was set for their servitude?
I don't think so. And I think one of the reasons why is we've got to think of a different culture in which everyone is tied to a family somewhere. And so just as in a feudal system in the Middle Ages in Britain, it would be very hard for many of these people to imagine themselves outside of that. A lot of people wouldn't really have desired. I mean, if you're in Abraham's house, I don't think you would necessarily have desired to be anywhere else. So that's where I think we've got to understand, just as many people take up all sorts of forms of employment today, that the Old Testament law says if if someone wants to run away, you give them a place because they clearly had a very hard time. But actually, that's not the general rule.
Are corporate visa sponsorships or the foreign domestic help arrangements where you give someone room, board, limited pay, 1 day off per month, similar to Old Testament slavery?
I think some of them will be similar to some of the situations that pertain for particular individuals. Yes, these are household dependents. Nowadays, we're in a very individualistic context where we don't think of people outside of households and we all just pursue our own employment. But I think that can be an analogy, but you want to make sure you don't push the analogy too far.
Okay, I love these questions. What some people think of is just really cool. So this is just a practical question. Peter Williams, which do you believe to be worse? Slavery, as practiced in the Old Testament, or self-imposed slavery to success, power, wealth, popularity, especially in Western culture? Which would you choose?
Well, I mean, I think that if you're going to look at the long-term thing, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? By far the worst thing would be if being a slave of sin, being a slave of your own ambitions and so on, the eternal consequences of that are far worse than being, at someone else's command.
Amen. Okay, this person may have meant, I don't understand, they may not listen to Bob Dylan, Jim Hoffmeyer, because they said, does the New Testament support the idea of freedom from servanthood, or does everyone have to serve somebody? Which Bob Dylan said. He said, you might be an ambassador to England or France, you might like to gamble, you might like to dance, you might be the heavyweight champion of the world, you might be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody.
So I think everyone has to serve somebody, yeah. I mean, you could be Caesar, and then you can live under the temporary illusion that you're not serving anyone for your life period.
Or Pharaoh.
Yeah, that's right. So these people who are at the top who think that they're not actually ultimately accountable to God, and we need to realize that everything we own is on loan. We are stewards, and one day we appear before God and we're to give account for everything we do. And just that's the reality.
All right, slave to sin. Slave versus servant in the New Testament. Paul talks about being a slave to sin. Christ has set us free. Were we actually slaves to sin or just servants?
I want to use the word slave everywhere. So with the Old Testament, my preference would be to render all 800 occurrences of the word eved as servant for consistency. And then my preference probably with the New Testament is to render every single occurrence of doulos as slave.
All right, Leviticus 19, 20 through 22. Why is a distinction to be made when a man sleeps with a slave woman versus when he sleeps with a free woman?
So again, this I would read it as because of the hardness of your heart. So Matthew 19, Mark 10, where actually people are in the Old Testament allowed to take these second-tier wives. That's not a good thing, I think, in absolute terms. When you go back to the beginning, you see this is very unideal, and whenever people have done that, there have been consequences.
Okay, Jacob's situation of working for his wives, was that slavery? If so, comparable to the slavery servanthood referenced by Paul?
I mean, in one sense, yes, I think it was slavery. Laban's a very cunning person because he gets at least 1 month's work out of Jacob before they even start negotiating on price. So, he's very keen. You see it back in Genesis 24. When he saw the gold on his sister's arms, he suddenly got, come in to Abraham's servant. So he's got an eye for a deal. And so I think, arguably, he was working somewhat like a slave. Jacob says, you change my wages 10 times. There may be some exaggeration there. But that Laban would be a very hard person to work for, but of course, at the same time, Jacob did manage to do far better out of it, both in terms of the family he got and the sheep.
Okay, someone is really impressed with your brain because they just threw this one passage. How do you explain Deuteronomy 26:68. Now, you cannot explain it because Deuteronomy 26 only has 19 verses.
Nailed them. I'm glad it didn't start on an answer.
How many languages have you read parts of the Bible in? New Testament, Old Testament, whatever.
Maybe about 12.
In a society such as the antebellum South, in which slavery is morally wrong and commonplace, what obligations do Christians have in addressing the problem in society or ending it? Similar question. The slavery that happened in America was an abomination before God and man. People have misinterpreted the Bible in order to gratify their own greed. Something should be made to make this right.
Yep.
And those two together first.
Okay, so I mean, if you're asking for a Brit for commentary on the Civil War, I'm going to refrain. If you want to know what to make of the Civil War,
let me ask
wait
it
for
this
Judgment
way.
Day.
Here's the question. Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. Then the question is, what obligations do you have? Well,
Yes.
It depends who you are. So if you're able to get political office to change things, then obviously you should do that. The question of whether a particular cause is worth a particular fight, I think one of the things we got with the Civil War is we got complexity of cause. It's not that there's only one thing going on, there's more than one thing going on, and 600,000 die and so on. I don't want to get drawn into evaluating something. It's obviously a good thing that slavery was abolished. It's obviously a bad thing that 600 people die, and in order to work out something, I don't want to get into the counterfactual. What would have happened if another historical route had gone on for the next 10 or 20 years? I simply don't know. All we know is what happened, and we know that a good end was achieved at a great price.
Last question. What then should we say to the atheists, the Sam Harrises?
Well, I think one of the problems with atheism, many problems, is firstly, what's the value of human life at all? We believe as Christians, as people who follow the Bible, even if you didn't have the New Testament just from following Genesis 1, that every human is in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. And that just goes through everything we do, that we believe that. What value does an atheist put on a person near the end of their life in a nursing home who doesn't have relatives? And the answer is just about nothing. What value does an atheist put at a person at the beginning of their lives, in the womb and so on? And we believe that because everyone is in the image of God, their value is not dependent on their own contribution to society, their own skill and so on, even if they have completely lost their mind. And so there's no personality to involve in because they've got a terrible form of dementia. That person is of infinite value. And that just is so important. And what does an atheist have to counter that? And the other thing is, of course, if we're just going to go in atheism, we're just going to think about, just throwing ourselves into the pleasures of society and materialism and so on, the inevitable product of that is it's going to lead to all sorts of oppression in the whole system. The human trafficking that's going on, so much of it is being fed by the sex industry, which comes basically from a desacralization of sexual behavior, which comes as part of atheism. This is all we are. Why shouldn't we just indulge in whatever pleasures? That is one of the, well, it's surely the biggest thing driving human trafficking. And so Christians actually have something to respond positively to that in wanting to actually take away all of the motivation for that sort of thing. So I think we've got a lot to say.
Would you join me in thanking Peter?